Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon. We are thrilled to have you at today's event, Two Sides of the Climate Coin, Sea Level Rise and Extreme Weather. I'm Sunshine Menezes, Executive Director of Metcalf Institute at the University of Rhode Island. I'm joining you today from the ancestral lands and coastal waters of the Narragansett and Eastern Niantic people. Their lands originally encompassed what is now the state of Rhode Island, Eastern Connecticut, and Southern Massachusetts. URI is one of many higher education institutions around the country that benefited from the unjust taking of land from Indigenous peoples as part of the U.S. Land Grant College Act of 1862. We still have much work to do to meaningfully address the history of land grabbing, genocide, and racialized injustice, but we are excited about the opportunities for learning presented by a collaboration with the Tamaqua Museum. Tamaqua has been engaging in dialogue about the history and present of the cultures of Southern New England's Indigenous nations since 1958. And the museum will be breaking ground on a new site on the URI campus next year. This also corresponds with a commitment from the university to provide full tuition to Narragansett students at URI. We look forward to the broader conversations about our shared history and present that will be advanced by this collaboration within the University of Rhode Island community. We created this important conversation today in collaboration with the Pulitzer Center, a nonprofit journalism and education organization that, among other issues, supports in-depth reporting on environmental and coastal issues, from its Rainforest Journalism Fund to its Connected Coastlines initiative. For those who are not familiar with Metcalf Institute, we work to advance informed, inclusive conversations about science and the environment. We do that through science training for professional journalists, communication training for scientists, and public events like this webinar and the Inclusive SciComm Symposium. We're so glad that you're joining us today, and we encourage you to let us know in the chat where you're tuning in from for today's event. So let me offer a few quick logistics. After our panelists talk, we'll have time for questions from the audience. Please click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen to add your questions at any time throughout the remarks. And you can use the chat icon if you're having any technology issues or want to share comments. Please note that all attendees are muted today, but if you can't hear us, let us know that via the chat box. Also note that we have sign language interpreters today, and if you would like to see captions during this discussion, you have a couple of options. You can click the CC or live transcript button at the bottom of the Zoom window. Or if you can't see that button, there are three little dots that you should see toward the right, and just select show subtitle or view full transcript. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the Pulitzer Center and Metcalf Institute YouTube channels for others who couldn't join us today. And one final logistical note, please stay online after this session ends to participate in a very brief survey. Now, I'll get to the meat of the conversation, and I'll start with brief introductions. Our moderator and speakers for today are Frank Carini, who's the editor of EcoRI, an online nonprofit news outlet in Rhode Island, Kate Michaud, who's town manager of Warren, Rhode Island, Dr. John Nelson, who is a visiting professor at the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society at Brown University, and Elder Gonzalez Trejo, who's a sustainability policy associate in the city of Providence, Rhode Island. Welcome, Frank, and our panelists. And Frank, please take it away.
Thank you, Sunshine. And also thank you, the Pulitzer Center and the Metcalf Institute, for organizing this event. And most importantly, thanks for the panelists and the online audience participating in this conversation. We have an opening question, which I'll mention in a minute, that all three panelists are going to start with. We did a little draft lottery to determine who would get to go first. John won or lost, depending upon your perspective. And so it'll be John will answer first, Kate, followed by Elder. And the question to start this conversation is, basically, tell us about the work you are doing related to coastal flooding and extreme weather, which is basically the title of this talk, and what you found. John?
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is John Nelson. I am the visiting professor of sociology at Brown University, and my research focuses on municipal governments, local economies, and inequalities related to adaptation to flooding due to sea level rise. I use both statistical and interview-based data from the municipal and neighborhood levels to better understand how communities' responses to coastal flooding are related to their demographics and local economic characteristics. A vitally important determinant of adaptation identified by my research is property tax. As you may know, property taxes are the principal source of revenue for many, if not most, municipalities, and they link to coastal flooding in at least two ways. First, the riskiest areas for development are often the most lucrative due to their proximity to the ocean. While we can all agree that a beach house is not a safe long-term investment, town officials have obligations they must meet in the short term, and so restricting development means foregoing what may be desperately needed revenue. Along that same line, buying out property owners in lucrative areas is even more expensive when one considers the lost tax revenue that would entail. Second, and perhaps most importantly, those same tax revenues are a significant determinant of towns' capacity to adapt to coastal flooding due to sea level rise. This creates a paradox in coastal communities whereby their ability to adapt could be reduced by adaptation efforts. For example, by removing homes from desirable at-risk areas, towns reduce future revenues that will be needed to deal with future crises, perhaps involving those very same properties. Federal aid to homeowners to help, for example, with reconstruction, reduces the risk to towns somewhat, but ultimately it only delays the inevitable loss of coastal property tax revenues, not to mention the human and social costs that flooding entails. If you take nothing else away from my remarks today, let it be this. Reliance on property taxes is just one of many reasons why municipal governments in the United States bear most of the responsibility for adaptation and are forced to either compete with one another for state and federal grants or go into debt in order to pay for adaptation efforts. These contests give an undue advantage to wealthier towns with higher property values that can then afford to hire staff to secure funding, thereby limiting smaller and less wealthy communities' ability to prepare themselves for the floods that we know are coming. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Kate, you want to take this question?
Sure. Kate Michaud, as was said earlier, I'm the town manager in the town of Warren, Rhode Island. I'm also a certified planner, so I come at my job from that perspective. I noticed there's a lot of people that are not from Rhode Island in the audience. So just for context, the town of Warren is a very small town. It's the smallest town in the smallest county in the smallest state. We are just over 11,000 people in population and right at just over 6 square miles of land area. So we're small in geography and in population. However, we're also very, very susceptible to climate change impacts. Our average elevation in the town is 7 feet. So obviously flooding is a primary concern for us, both from coastal flooding, from sea level rise, and also inland flooding from increased precipitation. So my job and how I've been dealing with the issue of resilience and preparations is that we've been trying to come up with comprehensive resiliency plans so that we can be prepared for what is to come. Reference was also made to some of the smaller and less wealthy communities, and that's us. So we have, I guess, 14 people in town hall, working in town hall, and that's everyone from the janitor to the building official to myself. So with a staff of 14 on the municipal side, we all wear a lot of hats, and it's a challenge for sure. Currently, we're working on a project that's called Market to Metcalf, and it's a project that we're really proud of. Through this project, we've identified an especially vulnerable part of town, the Market Street area, which is already experiencing impacts due to coastal flooding through the king tides. And we expect that significant impacts are to come from sea level rise. In this area, we've identified around 850 dwelling units and 204 commercial properties that are in serious danger of flood impacts. This represents about $138 million of value, which is about 10% of our tax base, or $2.4 million a year in tax revenue. So currently we are trying to plan for these impacts and to make plans to be proactive, to be prepared for climate change, and to have a plan so that we are not reacting to disaster. We are being proactive to preserve the community that we all love here. So I guess that's how we're working on this issue in a nutshell.
All right, thanks, Kate. Elder?
Hola everyone, my name is Elder Gonzalez Trejo. As mentioned, I am the Sustainability Policy Associate for the City of Providence, but today I'll be focusing on my work as Director of Community Programs for the Woonasquatucket River Watershed Council, where I spearheaded the New Voices program, or Nuevas Voces program. The Nuevas Voces program, the first cohort just completed the program. It was a cohort of 16 Latinx women living in an Onlyville community. The Onlyville neighborhood is a frontline community here in the city of Providence, but also in the state of Rhode Island. And this program aims to prepare these cohort members for leadership, train them in a way that will equip them to have these conversations, raise these issues with not just only their neighbors, but with local leaders. So throughout the program, we just provided resources, base knowledge of biology, and connected these folks to, again, state and local leaders, but also to other organizations and partners in the neighborhood. The program focused specifically on storm surge, flooding, and the urban heat effect, but today we'll talk about the work they did to address flooding and storm surge throughout the 8-month-long program. And yeah, that's kind of like what I'll be discussing today.
Okay, thanks, Elder. You broke up a little bit. I have terrible Wi-Fi or something down here in Portsmouth, but anyway, thank you. I assumed you were done. Yes, broke up on my side a little bit. Anyway, the second round of questions was not determined by our unofficial draft lottery. So I'm going to start with Kate, and she did mention the Warren's Market to Metacom Adaptation and Economic Development Initiative. It's forward-thinking, it's ambitious. But Kate, I'd like to know, what was the initial community response been like, and how do you and your small staff of 14 people that work in town hall keep residents and businesses engaged in a plan that's going to take years to see through?
Sure, it's certainly a challenge for us, and it's something that we're learning more about every day. Initially, we worked with a consulting engineer who helped us put the plans together. That was done through a number of public workshops. We have the Market to Metacom website. We have a Facebook page. We have a Twitter handle. We have a YouTube page. However, it's still been a challenge to engage with the public on these important issues. I think one thing that certainly got a lot of attention was a couple of front page news articles in a local newspaper. That certainly helps. One of the major challenges that we have is the way that municipal governments are set up to engage with the public, and that's primarily through the process for public meetings and the traditional notice process, which goes to property owners. In the area that we're talking about that's going to be severely impacted by flooding, about 44% of the property owners don't actually live in Warren, or they may even be out of state, not anywhere near here. So while it's important to keep them informed, it's just as important to keep the tenants and the people who actually live in these properties informed, because they're the people who are going to be impacted firsthand if there is an event, or if they are displaced from their property for some reason. So we're trying to learn lessons wherever we can learn them on how to engage with people more effectively. We will continue to use, again, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, recording videos, but we're definitely looking to learn some more lessons on how to more effectively engage with people. Maybe we talked about holding an event at a park in the neighborhood, maybe just set up a tent and invite people down on a casual basis to talk about their concerns and to hear about the project. But as you said, this is a long-term plan. We're looking at a horizon. We're really hoping to have some concrete action in the next 5 years. But this is an issue we're going to have to deal with for the next 100 years. So we are going to have some really good communication measures, and certainly it's something that we will look to improve on a consistent basis.
And some of the businesses you've spoken to, what's kind of been their response? Like, oh, I got to move, or I'm afraid to move, or I've been here for 20 years. This is my corner. Have you run into any of that? Or it's like, hey, yeah, that makes sense because my basement's flooding or my warehouse is flooding and we need to move.
It's pretty interesting because we actually had one business owner who was interviewed several months ago, and they had basically said to the journalist, this is my business, this is my family's business. We're not going anywhere. We'll figure it out, but we're definitely not going anywhere because we feel very, very strongly that this is the place we belong. And then Ida moved through, and I don't know how everyone else was impacted by Ida, but it hit Warren pretty hard, and we had some pretty significant flooding in town. And that same business owner was interviewed by a journalist several days after Ida and indicated, well, maybe it's time to start thinking about a future plan because this might not work out where we are in the long term. So I think people are seeing these events happening more and more, and it's changing the way that they're thinking about things because they're seeing it firsthand with their own eyes. And what we want to do is help them to create a plan. We don't want to displace people, and we certainly don't want them to leave Warren. We want to create opportunities for them elsewhere in town so that they can relocate to higher ground, but so that we don't lose them as residents or as businesses. So I think through having that positive engagement, hopefully we'll be successful in communicating with those business owners so that we can create an opportunity for them to transition to a new space without making them feel like they're being forced out.
Right. I guess Mother Nature is going to kind of show them the way that they're going to have to move. What about on the resident side? Have you talked to residents too about, you're going to have to move out of your apartment or eventually? I mean, they have the same kind of, we lived here for so long or something, or has there been different reaction from the resident side compared to the business side of people that could be not displaced, but move to a higher ground?
I think we've had mixed interactions. So, some people certainly are resistant to the idea and, totally understandable. I think we find often that when people indicate that they're afraid of change, what they're really afraid of is loss. So if we can identify what it is they're afraid of losing, then maybe we can help to make sure that they don't lose that. They don't lose their sense of community. They don't lose their place. But we've certainly seen some people who've reacted to our work and said, what took you so long? We've been thinking about this for a long time. Why are you just bringing this up now? So I think there's kind of both ends of the spectrum that we're seeing, and they're both good. As long as people are paying attention, I'll take the negative feedback and the positive feedback, as long as it's feedback. That's really what I'm concerned about.
All right. Well, thank you, Kate. Elder, this question's for you. The communities most impacted by the climate crisis are the ones already being distressed and marginalized by housing, pollution, racism, and other societal injustices, essentially authorized by the status quo. How do we activate these communities to engage in this massive global issue? All of us need to be part of the solution. When these communities are also dealing with a host of other problems, society has largely failed or mostly failed to adequately address.
I think you're spot on. I think that this needs to be a universal movement, not like an elitist movement, right? And so everyone kind of has to participate in this. And listening to Kay, I think that the New Voices program really focuses on preparedness, so that folks aren't wondering why we waited so long to kind of address these issues. And so I think that, when we think about community resilience work today, it really focuses on identifying and managing these vulnerabilities and this risk from a top-down approach, right? And so this approach often fails to meaningfully include equity-centered strategies that consider the most vulnerable populations, Black, Indigenous, Latino people who live in these frontline communities. So I think that, another part is to really focus on not just giving the community the ability to co-develop these strategies, but also allocating seats for them in boards and commissions so that their voice is heard and there's a polycentric kind of approach to addressing these issues. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach to activating communities, and I think that that's one of the issues. We think that we can provide this information to the public and that they'll all suddenly be concerned and they'll mobilize. But the truth is that the folks that live in frontline communities are so used to living in polluted conditions, dealing with these issues year after year. And on top of that, dealing with a plethora of other issues, eviction, deportation, unemployment. And so language access is another, right? Not being able to understand some of this information. So you really need to evaluate and assess the community you're going to work with, identify where you can provide incentives. So in exchange for their participation and their input, which is really what we want, right? Once you've done that, and through the New Voices program, it's what we did. We provided these incentives like childcare, transportation, compensation for participation, outdoor learning opportunities where folks were able to bring their kids, and we provided food and beverage. And in doing so, not only do we empower folks to kind of attend and participate, but remain and want to continue to act on the climate issues that they're facing. And so, and also, and additionally, like translation, language access, I can't emphasize that enough. In Onlyville, a lot of the folks that reside there are from immigrant populations, immigrant backgrounds, Guatemala, El Salvador, Dominican Republic. And so being intentional about what resources and tools you're providing is definitely key. And once you've activated folks, created that connection between, themselves and the space they live in, then we can talk about mobilizing and kind of like having this deeper conversation.
In my reporting, in the communities that you've mentioned that are, that are being marginalized, and, I talk to those people and they're frustrated mostly that they don't get a seat at the table. In your work in these communities, what have you found? Have you, at the state and local level, are these communities getting a seat at the table, or are they kind of off the periphery still? My report, they don't, and that's the biggest thing that really aggravates them and frustrates them, is that we're not being asked for our thoughts on what can be done and how it can be done and how it should be done.
Exactly. And I think in my experience, what I'm seeing is this large disconnect between the municipality and the folks that live in these communities. They're just not talking to each other. And so for an organization, a nonprofit like the Woodlands Kentucky River Watershed Council, a program like Nuevas Voces really serves, it allowed me to serve as a liaison between, the local leaders and the folks that live in the communities. But again, that's when I identified that issue of not really taking the time to analyze the communities that they want to have these conversations with, or to engage, and then providing the tools and resources. Things like just translation is enough to have some of the folks kind of like want to participate. But also, again, power sharing is key as well. You have to make room in these commissions and boards and at these metaphorical tables for these folks who live in these communities to speak up and address these issues and advocate for themselves, because that's where you're going to see leadership and community sustainability. And that's what we want to do. We want to give the community the power for them to kind of address these issues and kind of resolve them, obviously in partnership with the municipality and other organizations.
Do you see it as getting better? Your time doing this, if things improved in terms of just the communication, not even dealing with the climate crisis, but the communication between the various groups, state and local authority and these communities. Have you at least seen the trajectory that shows that communication channels are getting better?
I am seeing that, but I think it's only after these past couple of years when there was a lot of the racial issues that were raised, along with the climate crisis. I feel like that's finally put the spotlight on not just addressing these environmental issues, but also on taking the time to listen to these voices that have been marginalized for so long. And so, yes, I am seeing it, about time, but it's because of what's recently happened.
Well, thank you, Elder. John, you mentioned a little bit in your opening remarks, but I wanted to dig down a little bit deeper into, like, how are the policies and practices of the federal government, especially FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and their national flood program, impacting coastal New England's ability to adapt to sea level rise?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first, I want to point out that neither Kate nor Elder mentioned them, right, in the efforts that they're undertaking. So that sort of hints at their more or less absence or perhaps dereliction of duty with regard to helping communities. And in fact, I believe they harm them in three ways. They provide inaccurate information, excuse me, ineffective incentives, and exclusionary funding. So first, the information. We know that the NFIP, that's the National Flood Insurance Policy's maps for flood risk are out of date. They do not reflect sea level rise. They do not provide communities with an accurate measure of risk. And so that leads into ineffective incentives, right? So if the flood risk is understood to be lower than it actually is, that means people are paying less in flood insurance than perhaps they ought to be to reflect the true level of risk. What's the result? People are moving into or are staying in risky areas, and some of that risk is borne by the federal taxpayer. And at the same time, right, all the infrastructure that allows them to stay there, to live there, has to be maintained by cities and towns, often with little help from any outside agency. And what help they do get is often competitive. So there are a number of funding programs available through the feds, including FEMA, but often they're grants and they're competitive grants. And cities and towns have to put together a package, show that the cost benefit analysis is going to be positive. So already you have some discrimination against lower income communities where the value of properties that will be protected is perhaps lower than the cost of investments in infrastructure or buyouts or home elevations, right? And on top of that, there's no help or there's limited help for municipalities, cities, and towns to put together the grant applications. So, as Kate mentioned, they have 14 folks on staff. They have one planner, right? And these are, really sort of complex applications that have to be put together. And there's no guarantee that you're going to win, right? It's kind of a zero-sum game. Either you get it or, someone else does. And so I think you see FEMA sort of setting up communities, especially smaller and less wealthy communities, to fail with regard to this. So that would be my answer.
Thank you. And since really important for people that organize this and panelists and myself, we want the online audience to really be part of this conversation too. So I have a follow-up question. Well, it's not mine. It's from Terry Meyer. For you, John, and her question, how can towns that are not so wealthy, that don't have a strong tax base, share the dollar cost pain of climate change remediation so they remain fiscally healthy or above water, so to speak?
I mean, there's unfortunately not much that they can do themselves. Certainly, some towns can issue bonds to pay for projects like Warren has done, but of course, that's taking on debt against future tax revenues. Another avenue some towns have taken is sort of community collaborations. After all, some of these problems don't stop at the town line, right? So there can be some synergies. For example, between Warren, Bristol, and Barrington are all sort of right in the same, they all face very similar risk and they have shared infrastructure. And so maybe there's some opportunities to spread the cost around over those three different jurisdictions. But for sort of the big items, right, the larger infrastructure relocation projects, I really think that's got to come from the top down, that there needs to be a more equitable and perhaps adequate to the task availability of federal funding, because states, cities, and towns just they don't have the fiscal resources to prepare adequately.
All right. And a follow-up question from me, I probably already know the answer to this, but what's your take on the National Flood Insurance Program's new, if you're familiar with it, it's not that new, I'm not this year, new risk rating that is allegedly designed to result in insurance rates that are more equitable and more agile in the face of the climate crisis. So basically, they're changing the flooding maps. Are you buying their redesign or their new initiative?
Yeah, so I'm not super familiar with what all's got into that or how dynamic it's going to be. It's supposed to reflect each property's individual risk. There's still the question of providing insurance to homes that perhaps shouldn't be where they are, right? If we're thinking in a long-term perspective, and how, you reconcile the tax revenue that those homes provide, and that's sort of enabled by the flood insurance program, right? That's a benefit to towns. But at the same time, the infrastructure that they have to maintain and sort of the emergency management and risk issues that are entailed by that development. I do think it's a step in the right direction to reduce some of the those ineffective incentives that I mentioned earlier, but I'm not sure that it's not going to be enough for adaptation, but it might help mitigate some of the worst excesses of the program.
I think Kate wanted to mention, weigh in on the funding piece.
Sure. So obviously it's something that we're thinking about and that we're struggling with. Just one other method of funding some of the resilience work that we're thinking about here locally is tax increment financing. So in this Market Street area that's particularly vulnerable, we're talking about a managed retreat plan, basically. So we're talking about buyouts. Again, totally agree that the FEMA maps are inadequate. So we're not using the FEMA maps. We're using the URI storm tools, which is a fantastic resource. If anyone hasn't seen it, they need to look at it, because it's a great interactive online mapping tool. But as we're with that managed retreat, if we do buyouts of those properties, FEMA will fund 75% of that cost, but we need to come up with the other 25%. And then obviously there's the utility and infrastructure costs that go along with that. So we're proposing to increase density on Metcalf Avenue, which is an area that's high and dry, serviced by utilities. An excellent spot for increased density of development, both for commercial and residential development, highly underutilized at the moment, kind of the 1960s version, single story commercial with large parking lots in the front. So what we're looking is, if we implement a tax increment financing scheme on that development, then the additional tax revenue that would be realized through that increased density, then those funds could be reallocated and used specifically for the costs in the area that we're looking to advance the managed retreat. So it's not going to fix everything, but just another tool in the toolbox that we're looking to maybe tap to try to make this a reality.
Okay, well, while you're still here, well, of course you're going to be still here. Kurt Spalding had a question about the wastewater treatment plant. Basically, it's going to be lost to flooding in 2050. Has the town started planning for an alternative approach and system for managing recovering wastewater?
It's certainly something that we're working on. We have a new firm that's doing the operations of our wastewater treatment plant, and the reason we brought them on is because they're able to look at different scenarios for wastewater treatment. We think there's basically two major options. The first option is regionalization. Is there a way for us to pump our wastewater to a neighboring community that has a treatment facility that's in better shape from a climate perspective? And the second option is decentralization. Is it more appropriate for us to have, package plants or some kind of a smaller decentralized wastewater system that handles the different areas of town that are serviced by public sewer? So it's certainly something that we're working on. We don't have any answers yet, but it's on our horizon, and we know that our current wastewater treatment plant facility that we've just upgraded, it's viable up to 3 feet of sea level rise, but once we get past that 3 foot point, we could elevate the structure all you want, but it's going to be on an island. So what's the point of that? So past 3 feet, we certainly need some alternatives.
Okay, thanks, Kate. This question's, I'm going to start with Elder, but this this one could be all for Kate and John as well. But Elder, are there any models for community flood resiliency or climate resiliency that you've heard about or read about or seen that could be implemented or worked in Rhode Island?
Definitely. I think Rhode Island, or in the city of Providence particularly, is making efforts to, become a more resilient city. And so I think that there's a lot of talk around identifying green justice zones, and developing resilience hubs where folks can kind of go and participate in programs similar to Nuevas Voces from the WRWC, where they can, create emergency preparedness kits in the event of a flooding, or have access to interpreters or translators who can help them kind of like translate that information, or even just organize, right? So at these resilience hubs or these locations have meetings where, cohorts made up of stakeholders, shareholders, leaders, and residents, other partners can have these conversations and work collectively to address these issues.
Okay, thanks, Elder. Johnny, have you seen any across the country or the world for that matter that, Rhode Island could borrow, steal, that might work to help with, flooding resilience and, climate crisis resilience in your research and work?
Yeah, so I've really focused a lot on New England. So I do want to sort of give credit to Rhode Island for their municipal resilience program that has done some of the stakeholder engagement and making funds available to the projects that come out of these conversations between leaders and residents. And so, that's, I think, a successful program that could be built upon and expanded. But as far as other examples in the US or internationally, I can't speak to any specific ones, unfortunately.
Actually, Kate, this one, I'm actually going to veer off a little bit because we just got a question from somebody, Audrey, and she wanted to know, there seems to be a lot of talk about properties and property owners moving them and compensating them. However, lower income populations will likely be renters. What resources are available to help renters move away and find better places to live, and or how are they included in managed retreat plans?
So for the town of Warren, we're certainly considering the needs of renters in our managed retreat plans. And that's one of the primary focuses of the increased development on Metcalf. So we want to make sure that whatever housing is developed on Metcalf Avenue as an alternative is going to be affordable for the people who are going to be losing their ability to live on Market Street. So we're trying to make an apples to apples comparison, and looking at the actual affordability, not just the textbook definition of affordability. So, a lot of times that capital A affordable gets used where it's, it's not more than 30% of the median income for someone who's not more than 120% of the area median income. That's not the definition we're looking at. We're looking at, what are people paying now and what can they afford to pay, and creating housing opportunities within those price ranges. So that's going to be an important part of our plans, and it's going to be challenging, no doubt, to find developers who are willing to work within those confines. But we feel that if we start now and we provide a lot of time and thought into the plans that we're making, that we'll be able to meet those standards.
And I guess going back to the previous question that Elder and John tackled, has Warren or you come across some programs that are in New England or down the street or across the country that, hey, it's kind of the same what we're dealing with, we can implement them here? Have you found any of the initiatives that might, work for Warren?
So I mean, unfortunately, I think with a lot of these issues, what I find is that nobody's figured some of this stuff out, and it's kind of frightening because you think there's going to be, when you're a kid, you think that adults know everything, and when you're a small town, you think that the big cities must have it all figured out, but that's not necessarily the case, is what we're finding. So we're all learning together. I mean, I think on a small level, I really enjoy following what Maryland's doing. They have, they call it the Maryland Climate Academy, and they actually require people working within municipal government on climate issues to complete this climate academy and to become literate in climate adaptation and resilience measures. So, I think that's an interesting thing. But yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of communities that are doing great stuff. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of work to do, I think, for everyone.
All right. Thanks, Kate. John, we have a question from an anonymous Q. His question, or her question: how might some of these lessons learned be adapted to coastal farmlands? Typically, the focus for coastal flooding impacts are targeting urban and suburban areas. While Rhode Island may not have many of these, Warren does have, this could be for Kate too. Warren does have a few coastal farms. Could FEMA or USDA provide assistance to these properties to assist protecting these at-risk farmlands?
Yeah, so I think especially with farmland, you have the problem of saltwater intrusion, which I think would be pretty difficult to mitigate unless you hauled in a ton of like landfill to raise that soil above the sea level. Unlike apartments or housing units, you can't just pick up a farm, right, and move it somewhere else, right? It's sort of tied to the productivity of the land and the characteristics of the soil. And so, protecting those is going to be really difficult. And I think some farms will probably be pushed out of operation, unfortunately, unless, some effort is made to find suitable land elsewhere. But of course, we're pretty built out in this region. And certainly we don't want people moving into other floodplains. So they don't get a lot of priority. And I think some of that's because it's a small interest group and it's a really complicated one to answer. So I'm sorry, I don't have very encouraging things to say about that, but it's a great question.
Kate, have you talked to farmers in Warren that are, I know they're not part of the Metcalf thing, initiative farms there? Have you reached out, or have they reached out to you? Like, how can we need some help, or heard from them?
Yeah, we've actually been pretty active with a lot of our farming community, and a lot of them are coastal. FEMA, I can't say has been a whole lot of help in this, but USDA has. USDA and NRCS are both programs that have been helpful in helping farmers to come up with their own plans, helping with some mitigation. I think that in some cases, John's totally correct that you're not going to be able to deal with the saltwater intrusion with a lot of these crops. But it's a perfect location for marsh migration. So, that's where USDA and NRCS has come in with compensating the property owners, the farm owners, by buying conservation easements on the property so they get some income out of it, but then allowing for space for that marsh migration, which is so important to protect the rest of the property. If you have a healthy marsh, then you're going to have more protection from those storms, those coastal storms, and from the sea level rise. So I think maybe it's not 100% on point, but there's some help out there, and it is making it to the property owners.
Thanks, Kate. Elder, this is a question from Janine Silversmith. How can both formal and informal education organizations and systems, perhaps K through 12, but maybe more appropriately adult education, be leveraged to help solve some of these problems?
That's a great question. I think that it can be very helpful. Education and access to information is very helpful in empowering folks to take action. And even after the end of the first year of Nuevas Voces, New Voices, we followed up with all the cohort members, 16 of the graduates, to evaluate and just ask them a few questions about what they may have wanted more out of the program. And undoubtedly, education, both youth and adult, was brought up. And so I think that education as it relates to the environment, but also infrastructure and policy, is really important, because it's unfair to just turn to the community and ask them what they want when they don't even know how to solve this issue, right? So providing them with information around how green infrastructure can help alleviate some of these issues, or just a base knowledge of the environment and pollution and contaminants, but also historical education, right? I think that identity plays a large role in their environmental circumstances. And so kind of having that context and that information and allowing them to understand like, oh, perhaps I live by this polluted river or on this contaminated soil or land because of my Black identity or Latinx identity or Indigenous identity, allows them to, inspires them, I think, but also empowers them to address these issues. Whereas normally some of these folks don't know even how to raise these issues. So I think education is key, but I think also youth education is really important because even throughout the program, the 8-month-long program, oftentimes these cohort members would ask if their kids could come out and participate and learn because they wanted their children to learn about this. So I think that that's one way to definitely engage the community is creating programming, not just for adults, but for youth that focuses on education.
Actually, Aldo, I'm going to stay with you. A woman, Elizabeth, just asked a question talking about, New England's already experiencing more extreme precipitation events, but she was wondering specifically, but Olneyville specifically is already flood prone. What measures are being taken there, could be taken to prevent flooding in Olneyville and, other flood prone areas of Providence? Have you seen anything with your work in Olneyville and that could measures be taken?
Yeah, well, at the moment, I know the NCRS is working to develop some more infrastructure that will help prevent some of that flooding. I really think that preparedness is key because I don't think there's going to be like an immediate solution to this, and it's something that the community is going to continue to endure during hurricane season. But I think that helping residents prepare for these situations is what we're aiming to do at the moment, while we continue developing kind of like strategies to prevent flooding.
All right, as we wind down the conversation, we have 12 minutes left, but there is a question. Actually, it's from Sunshine, and it's a good one. And I'm going to kind of go in the reverse, or not kind of, it will be the reverse order from the beginning. So, Elder, the question is, are there ways in which Rhode Island cities and towns are connecting fossil fuel divestment with their adaptation efforts? That is, are these things being framed by municipal officials as connected issues? Have you seen that? I think you're on mute.
Yes, sorry.
Oh.
I think that I really, as this new role as the Sustainability Policy Associate, my focus has been in the city of Providence recently. And I think that, there's a lot of work that I've heard about regarding like residents and having conversations around zoning and working to reduce the carbonization or decarbonizing certain neighborhoods or institutions. And so I'm not really too familiar with what's happening in Rhode Island and how these towns might be connecting.
Kate, has Warren talked about, divesting from fossil fuels, or is that any time part of the conversation?
It's definitely part of the conversation. I can say our elected officials, the town council, they bring up these issues a lot. And I think from my perspective, maybe they're connected because they both adaptation efforts and fossil fuel divestment both have it's a focus on fiscal responsibility, right? So being reliant on fossil fuels is not fiscally responsible, and ignoring adaptation is not fiscally responsible. So kind of that's the common thread. Here in Warren, we're looking right now, we're going through the final permitting stages on a ground mounted solar array that's going to be installed on a closed landfill on town property. That solar array is going to offset all of our municipal usage for the town's own usage for electricity. We look at fleet conversion, and then like you said, like has been mentioned, we look at things like zoning and how does our zoning make it hard for someone to not have a vehicle. We have a lot of people in town who don't have access to a vehicle. And we have a lot of people in town who don't choose to have a vehicle. And how can we support their efforts, and how can we make sure that we're not making it harder for people to divest themselves from being connected to fossil fuel? So it's definitely something we're thinking about. It's definitely something we're working on. Again, there's still a lot to do. We're at the very beginnings of chipping away at this stuff, but it's certainly part of the conversation.
John, have you come across that? cities and towns talking about divesting from fossil fuels? Is that part of your research, or any of come across that in your work?
So one thing that comes to mind is a bill that I think has been before the State House here in Rhode Island at least once, maybe a few times now, that would tax fossil fuels at the Port of Providence, and that money would be redirected to an adaptation fund available to cities and towns. That has failed. In my conversations, more specifically with cities and towns, I haven't asked about this, and so perhaps that's why I'm not hearing about the connection between the two issues, though I have read basic 39 emergency management plans, and they're concerned with much more sort of practical issues, right? What infrastructure is at risk, what populations are at risk, what concrete actions can we do to reduce that risk, right? And so I'm really happy to hear that Warren is moving ahead with that solar farm, and thinking about walkable cities and public transit, those sorts of things. But connecting it directly with adaptation, I haven't seen much of that. And like I said, that one effort that I am familiar with has not been successful.
Okay, thank you. I have a question, I guess a final question for all of you. I think we have time to get it in. And it's actually one that I get a lot after talking to lay people, or also politicians or people in government. They ask me this after I talk to them about, whatever climate project we were talking about. And I know you guys have all different backgrounds and area expertise, and people somehow think that because I'm a journalist, I have all the answers, when in fact, I don't have any. But in your opinion, how do we move forward, any meaningful action on the climate crisis forward? It's like we're running on a treadmill and not getting anywhere. How do we push forward on this? And this is the question I get asked a lot. My answers, if you ask the people, probably are terrible, so I'm not going to bother sharing my answers. But what do you guys see as how do we move this forward? How do we push the rock and stop pushing it up the hill? I will start with Kate.
Sure. I mean, I think everyone's always said, for me, the main issue is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think in Rhode Island, that's especially true. Don mentioned the Coastal Adaptation Fund and the legislation that was proposed to put a very tiny tax on petroleum imports to the state. I actually went and testified on behalf of that bill. The impact would have been for an oil tank fill up. The impact to the person purchasing the oil would have been a quarter, 25 cents. And it was shot down. And, I was there testifying, and the person sitting next to me testifying was a lobbyist on behalf of the petroleum industry. And, sometimes it feels like you're banging your head against the wall when, you've got a highly paid, highly trained, well-dressed, well-mannered person who's there to argue against you, and that's their only job. And I've got 25 other things going through my head, and I managed to make it there, and I'm kind of flying by the seat of my pants trying to give testimony. So I think that's a big thing is, being there and being able to show up. And I know that that's a privilege to have the time and the ability to show up and testify and speak on those things. But I think especially at the State House and on the state level, it makes a big difference. So I don't know if I really answered your question.
I don't know. I don't even know if it's answerable.
But yeah, I think there's a lot of things that that are happening and that are being proposed, and it's just a matter of maybe it doesn't work this year, but you keep chipping away at it, and maybe next year it happens, or maybe the year after it happens. This isn't a sprint, it's a marathon, and we just need to keep pushing. And I think the more people push and the more vocal they are about it, the more it's going to get done.
Elder, thank you. Elder, what do you think? How do we move forward we're just scratching the surface on this? How do we get true momentum built, or locally, regionally, worldwide? I mean, what are your thoughts on how do we get farther along quicker?
I think what we're doing now is kind of like a great example. I think that both Kate and John have provided information and perspective to me that I wasn't aware of, and they've addressed different issues from different sectors. And I think that we have an ASL interpreter on this call, and it's got all the tools that I hope to see in cohorts or in boards that exist here in Providence, in the state, or even just anywhere in the country. It's like having these different voices from these different sectors and working towards this common goal, talking about what's working, what's not working, and I find, and just acting on that. And because some of these conversations just seem to be repetitive, or we're having the conversations with the people who are doing the same work. So I think that insight from these different levels is important. And again, providing these tools so that all these voices are heard is also important.
Thanks, Elder. John, what's your take? How do we smash through the status quo?
Well, I think, I'm not going to mention names, but there's a community in Rhode Island that has the political will to be really progressive on climate, right? They've got people on their town council who really care about this. But historically, they've had a pretty low tax rate, and they pride themselves on their low taxes. And when I talk to the planner, hey, there's, these adaptation programs out there, why don't y'all take advantage of those? And he says, well, in fact, our council's, asking us the same thing. And I give them the same answer, that nobody wants to pay for it, And there was a great video in the New York Times about the sort of liberal hypocrisy of preaching inclusion and, against inequality. But when you look at liberal states, you see a lot of failures to live up to that rhetoric. And so, I think to some extent, like with the State House, right, we have the Executive Climate Change Coordinating Council, the EC4. We also saw that fossil fuel tax failed to be implemented. I think you see a lot of talk and not that much action. And we shouldn't be asking the most vulnerable communities to pay for this, but, and so that's going to require sacrifice, right? And is that from a national level carbon tax? Is that a state level? Is that more redistributive policies? I think it's all of the above. But we need to move past this sort of year-to-year mindset, right, of maintaining growth and look instead at potential avenues for sustainability, for finding sort of a level at which everyone can live and live well and continue to do so into the future. And that's not really something that's made it into the mainstream yet. But thanks for the question.
Well, John, thank you. And I thank all the panelists, and I appreciate all the great questions from the online audience. And I'll leave final thoughts for Ann Peters of the Pulitzer Center.
Thanks so much, Frank. And the center is so pleased to have supported your reporting from Rhode Island. And as I work with our university and communication education, it's just been terrific that we were able to share all the work and expertise of our speakers today. So thank you, Kate and Elder and John. And Elder, just to echo what you said, bringing so many people together from different walks of life and different backgrounds and knowledge is a great way to get things started. To our audience, we thank you also, and please stay with us just a few moments longer while we wrap. On behalf of the Pulitzer Center, I also want to say how much we appreciate working with the Metcalf Institute, and thank you to Sunshine and her colleague, Catherine McDuffie, who worked with us from the beginning to make today's conversation happen. Thanks also to my colleague, Holly Rosewood, who produced our event. As was mentioned before, we'll be posting this conversation online so you can share it onwards, both from the Metcalf Institute and the Pulitzer Center websites, where you can also find out how to become a Pulitzer Center champion. After we officially end, please take our brief survey so we can learn from you, our audience, and we're eager to hear more. Thank you again for joining us. Goodbye for now.